Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 56 of the Yorkshire Gamers Elite Big War Games podcast. And today is going to be the first of a two-part special episode on the Battle of Jutland. And I've got a very special guest, Mr. Nick Jellicoe, who I'm sure you're aware was or is the grandson of the Admiral of the British Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. So we'll be going over to speak to Nick very shortly. And just like to say thanks very much everyone who's tuned into the previous episode on Rapid Fire. That's gone really well, as has the one prior to that, the World War One Mesopotamia episode with Nigel Atter. Those two episodes and this one as well were recorded in a very short space of time, just over 2 weeks, and I was hoping to get this out, this Jutland episode for Salute, which unfortunately didn't happen. But more about this episode in a moment. I attended Salute at the weekend, just gone, and I had a great time down in London. We travelled down on Friday night, me and my friend Andy Dickinson, regular Yorkshire gamer and member of the Leeds War Games Club. And we stayed overnight. We went out into that there London, met up with Des Darkin, Ian Fuller, Sven Focuson, and a couple of other guys. And we had some beers in a wonderful pub near London Bridge and eat some food. And we weren't completely skinned afterwards. And then it was on to the big show at Salute the next day. Jutland, as you know, 32 foot by 8 table, and four guys came along and ran the game, played the game, while I kind of did front of house and spoke to as many people as I possibly could who were interested in the game. So special thanks go out obviously to Andy for coming down with me and effectively running the game, because I was busy chatting all the time, and Simon Stokes and Rob Hutton from the Naval War Games Society, who very kindly gave up their time, and James Cutts from Shaco and Sprues YouTube channel, who kind of got kidnapped really and helps us out for the day. But he said he had a great time. So thank you to all you guys who made that possible. Thank you very much to the South London Warlord Club, and if you've not listened to already, I did a special Salute episode with Martin Gain, who's the president, and Phil Andrews, who organised Salute a couple ago. I think it was 53. So that's worth a listen if you've not had chance to have a go at that one yet. So on to today's episode, and I spent a wonderful 4.5 hours, would you believe, with Nick Jellicoe, and we covered loads of topics around Jutland, but also around Nick's father, who was also involved in World War II, and Nick himself. You know, he's a wonderful guy. He's had a fantastic career. We chatted around various things that he'd done as well. So with that 4.5 hours, I didn't want to put it out in a single episode, and this is the first time in a long time that I have split a guest episode in half. And I just thought, one, I've recorded three very close together, which has kind of timed me out a little bit with that. Putting together this episode with 4.5 hours of recording is a long job. So what I've done is I have split it down, and the first section we talk about Nick himself, his father, some other bits and pieces around his life, and then we move on and we talk about the prelude to the Battle of Jutland, and that's where I've ended this episode. And it's going to be about an hour and 45, maybe 2 hours long, and then I'm going to come back in 2 weeks' time with the rest of the episode, which will be about the Battle of Jutland itself and also about the aftermath of the battle. It's going to give me a nice break because I've already got this recorded, and it gives me a little bit of a breathing space, get some enthusiasm and energy back. My next guest I've already spoken to, and I just need to book that in when this episode, well, the next episode with Nick goes out, and then I've got an idea who's going to go in the episode after that. So it's all hunky-dory at Yorkshire Gamer and the podcast. Really enjoying it after that little dip a couple of episodes ago. So get your historian heads on. Nick is a lovely guy. He really explains things really well. Get yourself a brew, get yourself some biscuits. This is a cracker. Without further ado, here's the interview. Well, hello everyone, and welcome once again to the interview section of episode 56 of the Yorkshire Gamer Reap Big War Games podcast. And today we've got another dip into a period of history related to one of my favourite battles. And boy, have we got a special guest for you today to help us to do that. On the afternoon of the 31st of May 1916, the navies of Britain and Germany clashed in what would develop into be the largest fleet action of the First World War, and in fact the only full-scale battleship action of the war. Although at the time it was unknown, it was the last major action fought between these types of ships. In future wars, the aircraft carrier would become king. 2016 saw the 100th anniversary of the battle, and here at Yorkshire Gamer, we marked the event by building all 250 ships. I'm still recovering, involved in the battle and recreating the action on a huge table at a number of shows in the UK and at the Royal Armouries here in Leeds. At this year's salute, I'm going to blow the dust off those models and the display will be on show again. To mark the return to the table, I thought, why not do a show on Jutland? I reached out to today's guest, expecting him to say, "Who are you?" But he's very kindly to agree to spend some time today with me chatting about this all important battle. So, my guest today is the grandson of Admiral John Jellicoe, Commander of the British Grand Fleet. His book, Jutland, The Unfinished Battle, was a most welcome updated look at the battle itself, with a detailed look at the build up, the battle, its aftermath, and some detailed research in many documents that hadn't been properly looked at before. It also proved to be a bit of an adventure for our guest as well that year. He was out at sea, he was on documentaries, he was running a
Mm.
website, he was doing animations. It must have been a fantastic journey and adventure for him, and I'm sure he'll share those memories of that year today. So let's give a warm welcome to today's guest, Mr. Nick Jellicoe. Welcome, sir.
Ken, great to be with you. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me on the show.
Lovely. It's a real pleasure. So you've had a quick chance to listen to a bit of one of my previous podcasts that I did on the Papal Zouaves. So you've kind of got a bit of an idea of what to expect, haven't you?
A bit of an idea, but you got to lead me through this.
That's no problems at all. So if you don't mind, I always like to, just for my listeners, to get a little bit of a background about you as an individual. I always think it's quite rude just to go straight off into the topic without
Sure.
getting to know yourself. So where was family home initially? Where were you born and brought up?
I was actually brought up in London, and I was my parents had divorced, so I stayed with my mother in the house in London, and my father had his place in the country. I suppose consequently, because of that, I didn't have many of the kind of conversations that a son would have with his father about his father's father.
Yeah,
And so it wasn't really until, I guess, much later in my life, really when I was kind of going towards the end of my business career, that I really got interested in this. And it was because of a visit of a cousin of mine to Switzerland that the whole topic really was put on the table. And he had challenged me to try and do something on Jutland, and I said, "Look, really, I don't have a very much time. I'm pretty busy." I thought about it actually just over that weekend, and by Monday, I said, "Yeah, okay, I'm on board." And the reason was not because I had anything necessarily particularly new to say about Jutland. Was it was more because my background had been in advertising and communications, and I think that keeping history alive is very much about how you talk to the new generations, how you engage them, and to try and turn away a little bit from too academic an approach, but to engage people, as you mentioned, with animations and videos and websites. That's the language of the new generation. They don't read hefty 250-page
yeah.
books. So I was kind of intrigued by that approach, and that's what really hooked me at the end.
Yeah, so had you not had any? You'd not been a historian prior to that, then your career, I believe, had been in advertising and communications, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I suppose when I was at uni and growing up, actually, I was always very interested in history, always very
Mm.
interested in politics, and studied Chinese politics when I was at uni at York University. Um, but I never really kind of engaged with Jutland, I suppose, till, oh gosh, maybe uh, 10 years or so before when I started reading Andrew Gordon's book, which my wife gave me for
Oh
Christmas.
wow.
And that kind of whetted my appetite, but not sufficiently that I really,
Mm.
knew much about it or could really talk about it with much confidence. And I suppose coming in or coming towards 2016, in fact, in 2011, I suddenly realized, we've got 5 years to get our act together and see what can be done. And I mean, I know what the planning time is and
Yeah.
the implementation time for these sort of things. So 5 years, in fact, was a short time to write a book, get websites done, get museums involved, put a social media program together, etc. Um, so when I decided, it was kind of, full pelt forward because, as I say, Jutland was never a particular conversation, a detailed
Mm.
conversation around the dining
Yeah.
table at home. I guess, they all suppose that I knew something about it or had read something about it, but it wasn't the
Yeah,
case.
there was
Um,
no lining up of salt pots on the table to recreate the crust
no,
of
no,
the
no,
tea or
no.
anything like that.
and and yet, when I look back on it, I mean, I was surrounded by it,
Yeah.
but never really sort of took it on board. In the kitchen, we have those. I'm trying to remember who the particular potter was. Those wonderful sort of Toby jugs of the
Ah, yeah.
yeah, you know the
Yeah.
ones. Gould, I think they are, and they're lined up on the sort of on the sort of the kitchen cabinet, um, and that was one thing. Then there was obviously around the house there were a lot of paintings and pictures, and in my father's study, obviously he had all his collection of sort of naval books and books from his father, and my father also, he'd actually been the last holder of the office of First
Mm.
Lord, and so he had a kind of natural interest. And my grandfather was, as you know, after Jutland, he was the first Sea
Yeah.
Lord. So there was an incredible kind of, there was an enormous amount of history floating around me. But I guess I was just pretty engaged and distracted by other things
Mm.
that adolescent is.
Yeah. I think there's also an element of it being normality for you. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
my
You take a lot for granted.
exactly, and the pictures on my wall of my dad playing for the Broken Cross football team and stuff like that. It's just,
Yeah.
that could have been him playing in the 1966 World Cup final for all I knew. It was family, and it's only later on that the relevance of that becomes more obvious.
I think it's sort of later in life that you suddenly realize, what is your, well, you suddenly realize
Mm.
you confront yourself with, a question: what is your legacy? What are you going to leave behind?
Mm.
It certainly wasn't my business career in my case. It wasn't what I was most proud of, although I enjoyed my time in business. But I think this gave me something that I was really passionate
Mm.
about. And the passion was driven by an increasing feeling as I read about my grandfather that he had been pretty unjustly treated
Yeah, yeah.
in history, and that that's the way the political world is, whether it's in the military
Mm.
or it's in civilian service. But the politics always behind the scene is what rewrites history and what leaves the ultimate real
Mm.
story behind, or unreal story as it might be. And one has to just kind of deal with that. And I felt that, this was going to be a huge opportunity, and it really could not be one that was overlooked or that I didn't really pay attention to, because then I would never have forgiven myself. But you said it earlier, meantime, in 2016, 2017, I had a terrific time doing this and met so many people in so many walks of life around the world, frankly, whose stories sometimes I was able to add just a small element to for them to actually close the circle. And a typical case of that was, oh gosh, grandson of one of the people who'd been on HMS Spitfire,
Mm.
900-ton destroyer that collided with a 20,000-ton dreadnought, NASA, in the middle of the night. And he and I just got to know each
Oh,
other. And
brilliant.
some of the things that I had in my collection kind of fit into what he was looking for, and vice versa. And there were these wonderful moments where things started to click
Yeah.
together, and that was fulfilling in itself. And then, having the opportunities that I had, I mean, I was in an incredibly privileged position, and certainly my grandfather's name opened doors for me that would never have been there had I not been named as I
Mm.
was. Um, Not only in the UK, in Royal Naval circles or in museum circles, but actually, funnily enough, probably more so in Germany.
Interesting.
Um, and I think that they really appreciated the fact that I was reaching out to them to try and see if we could get a more holistic, more, let's see, a less biased, less nationalistic point of view on the battle. Because I think, to the victor always belongs the story. And that's certainly the case with Jutland. And I think, in the case of the German accounts, having gone through, you know, this terrible political turmoil of the 20th century in which the roles of individuals sometimes were very
Mm.
carefully covered up because you never quite knew who was in power and you never
Yeah.
quite knew if you were in danger for some previous points of view. That was particularly the case. Whereas in the Royal Navy, there are these books, like the some accounts of the Jutland through the through the experiences of whatever it was, 45 or 60 men and
Mm.
officers, and there were these incredible, not only above deck, but more importantly, below deck experiences of what it was like to have fought in the battle. You didn't get that very much from the German side. And the fact that, the British disallowed photography, or most navies disallowed photography because they thought it was a sort of security breach, meant that researching this was even more difficult. And then researching something at sea where there are no visible signs left after an engagement like this, on the surface at least, makes it, doubly difficult. So the work that um, was done with the expeditions, the archaeological expeditions with Gertner and Anderson and McCartney, Innes McCartney, were incredibly important because it actually pieced together the last pieces of the battle. And it's interesting that the last wreck of the battle, Warrior, was only found in August, I think, of 2016. And that was really because of this sort of perseverance of just going back and just, working through very carefully and very quietly what the logical positions of these ships would have been. And Innes was able to find some sort of extraordinary twists that none of us had known about.
Mm.
Indefatigable. This famous last photograph of her, blowing up and sinking was sort of misleading because by that point there was nobody left alive on the ship. It was a ghost ship, and her stern had been left far behind. Those were sort of completely revelatory when he came up with those propositions. So it's really interesting how history, I think, because of the advances in technology and archaeology, has been given a kind of new burst of life that really challenges a lot of preconceived opinions about what actually might have happened.
it's a great way to have new perspectives on a battle that we're quite often
Yeah,
led by, as you say, those original accounts that quite often have a political bias towards them. They're quite
yeah,
often, as I will explore later on, where there's different camps on either side trying to get their story across. I've just done a podcast a couple of episodes ago about World War
yeah,
One in Mesopotamia, and that was a very similar thing with the siege of Kut and how that was spun to the British public back then in the official histories, and how writings and investigation into
yeah,
Indian records, because it was mostly Indian army there, have changed our perspective on that particular conflict. And very similar with yourself and Jutland. And it's an amazing legacy that for your grandfather, you've done all this. You could have just quite easily, when you were challenged, go, "Oh, you know what? I'm busy."
my wife wasn't too pleased when
Was she
you know,
not?
more and more battleship paintings went up in the house, and all I could talk about was battleships for 5 or 6 years. She's been very patient.
Yeah, I think Mrs. Riley can join in
Of the
in
same.
condolence with your life, because I've got pictures of battleships and everything everywhere in
But I
our
mean,
house.
the most wonderful thing, in fact, occurred. I saw I saw on the web one person who'd been actually building a replica of Iron Duke, and he was doing it as a scratch model.
Mm,
And a guy called Ron Horobin,
yeah,
really salt of the earth, a brickie. He
yeah.
built his own house,
Oh,
and I
fantastic.
called him up and I said, "Listen, Ron, this is a little bit out of the blue. Would you mind if I drove up and came and visited because I'd really like to see the model?" When I got up there, his wife was sort of saying, we're dying in battleships. Please just take it, give it to him, Ron. Get it out of the house. You can imagine. I mean, I was delighted because, in fact, that became a great centerpiece that we lent to museums in Germany and in Denmark. Now has gone back to London, but and my book is actually dedicated to Ron.
Oh,
Uh,
oh,
he's one of the people
fantastic.
I dedicated to it because that's the kind of enthusiasm that I really respond to, and it's not necessarily the academics who really have that. It's
Yeah.
people who are studying microhistories or trying to understand what went on in a particular ship and really getting into the sort of the nitty gritty of it, and I love
Mm,
that.
mm.
But yeah, he's sorely missed.
Oh, bless. That just reminds me, actually, during the research I was doing for this interview today, there was a picture of a solid silver copy of the Iron Duke that I think
Oh, it's in
given.
Portsmouth.
Ah, right. I was just
It's
going to
at
ask, where
the
is that?
uh, it's at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. It, funnily enough, I think that was the ship that was the model, the silver model that was presented to my grandfather in the afternoon of Christmas Eve, uh, 1917.
Mm,
Hours, and inside was a scroll with I think signed by the officers
mm,
of Iron Duke at that time and the officers and leading ratings. 2 hours later is when the letter from Geddes arrived,
yeah.
eventually effectively sacking my grandfather. It was
What a shame.
really
Yeah, a sad side to a wonderful,
a very
wonderful
ironic,
model. And yeah.
very sad way to sort of end
Mm,
a career. I mean, there are mistakes and weaknesses in all men, and I think that's the interesting thing about Jutland is that, or maybe that's the disappointing outcome of Jutland in the sense that the the division into the battle cruiser camp or the dreadnought camp, those who are Jellicoe followers and those who are
mm,
Beatty followers, was really unfortunate because it made it a kind of black and white discussion about charisma, characters, and the individual comportment of each officer rather than allow a really healthy fleshing out of what actually went wrong.
Mm.
And it wasn't necessarily what went wrong, as Nicholas Lambert and others would point out, and Andrew Gordon would point out. It wasn't necessarily what went wrong at Jutland. It
Mm.
was what had gone wrong for years and decades
Mm.
leading up to Jutland. And that, Jutland was an incredibly rude awakening for a navy that was just basking in its glory and its past traditions. And I think that's why it's become so interesting to sort of say other navies like the American Navy, and why Gordon's book was so accepted, was that it's a there's nothing like, there's no training or there's no testing of equipment and tactics and strategies until you're really in the thick of it.
Yeah.
No amount of bookish research will get you to that point. And I think the Americans were sort of very increasingly worried that their navy was ossifying in the same way that the Royal Navy was ossifying in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I think it's very important for, I think, anyone who works in any line of any job where risk is involved or where you're planning for something that is an unforeseen event. You're never ever going to get it completely right. And I think we've all
Yeah.
gone through that in our careers, and we've turned up at something, and
and
it's
and
gone.
how?
Oh,
Yep.
oh,
Yep.
maybe we should have
Yeah.
done
Yeah.
this. So
Yeah.
hindsight is a wonderful thing. Um, I'd just like to return, if I may, to your earlier life, and you were saying that you studied in York, and obviously we're a Yorkshire-based podcast. So,
Mm.
what was your time like in York?
Loved it.
Yeah.
I've always loved the north of England, or Scotland, even to go even further north, more than I like the southeast. I think the southeast actually has represented the worst of what Britain is about in many ways. It's
Yeah.
become such an accumulation of wealth, and the division of have and have not is so pronounced
Mm.
that I actually found my time in New York a really refreshing time, and it was. I have very very fond memories of those times. I didn't stick around. It was sort of it was. I actually did my first year, and I got to the end of my first year, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm got into York, but I'm not actually really engaged. So I took a year off and went and worked in Austria, and traveled. I think I traveled to China that year, and did some things that I really went and studied in Paris,
Mm.
and then I went back, and then I worked. But I really put my nose to the grindstone, and really, as a consequence, enjoyed it. I mean, I think that's where I really got to the point where I sort of said, look, enjoy every single moment and commit to it. Otherwise, just don't do it.
Mm.
Just not worth it. But yoga's a great place.
Yeah. So, I suppose I've got to ask then, was there a pressure for you to have a military career yourself?
There wasn't a, there wasn't so much of pressure on it. I mean, I actually had thought about a military career, and I think it's probably the only thing, the single thing that I regret not having followed through. I wanted to do a short service commission, not in the Navy,
Yeah.
not with that, not with that name. That would have given pressure.
Yeah.
But I actually wanted to join the Irish Guards. My mum was half Irish, and I was really really close to doing that, and then I don't know, stupidly didn't follow through because I think some. I've always rather believed in sort of national service.
Mm.
I think it's a great social leveling
Yeah.
uh, that takes place, and it's not a bad thing. But I drifted away. I got distracted. Wanted to get on with my life. I wanted to become a photojournalist, actually, and
Yeah.
I suppose that was my interest in politics more than anything else. But didn't cut the mustard when it came
Mm.
to some of my photography. So chose, I think, what I thought was the sort of closest thing to it, where I could have some sort of creative outlet, and went into advertising. But going into advertising gave me a chance to look at a number of businesses that I would work on over the next, I don't know, 15 years or so. And the obvious place to start in advertising was not necessarily the UK, it was
Yeah.
Madison Avenue.
Yeah.
So I went to the States. I think behind that was also the feeling that, frankly, I wanted to make it on my own terms and wanted to get out and spread my wings and not be under the sort of constant shadow of a name, which would have been the case in England. So I went to the States, eventually met my wife there. We married after a couple of years and stayed on in the States and came back to the UK, then went back to Miami and then worked in Rome for a couple of years and then came to Switzerland in I think the late 90s. I think it was I came in 97 and Trish, my wife, followed in 98. And we decided to really make our lives here and stay here. We loved it.
So is Switzerland, would you say, home now? Is that
Yeah,
you've settled
no,
now
it is home.
after all that travel?
It is home. I mean, I think there comes a certain point where it's not necessarily a question of, well, where are you going to get better health benefits or this or that,
Yeah.
or where you've been brought up. It's more a question of, you know, do you really want to sort of start the whole circle of trying to build a new circle of friends, etc., etc. And we didn't want to do that. The only thing I do miss here is that access to things like the National Archives or the British Library entails a trip, and traveling to London is expensive.
Yeah.
And that is quite difficult. It does make things a little difficult, but you know,
Well, thank you very much for that. That's lovely to have a little bit of a background on yourself. And I'm just going to mention one other thing before we move on to Jutland and John Jellicoe, because you did wrote another book as well, didn't you, about George Jellicoe? So just briefly there,
yes,
well, this is probably
the saga
this is wholly another podcast, but just briefly, just mention
saga
about your
goes
book
on.
on George.
um, Yeah, you asked me why I never went into the Navy. George always said he never went into the Navy because he used to pee in his bunk or in his bed, and he was terrified of having a hammock and
Yeah.
what happened to the guy below. I don't know whether that was a true story or George just making it up. He was a wonderfully self. He had a wonderful self-deprecating sort of sense of humor. George was a pretty hard act to follow. He was, even though he grew up with so-called silver spoon in his mouth, 1939, 40 was a very rude
Mm.
awakening. He took it as a bit of a lark at the beginning, and then I think when the Munich Agreement was signed, he really found it a shameful act
Mm.
that this country sort of effectively turned its back on Europe. But he went the traditional route, joined the Guards, really got bored of it very fast, uh, joined the Commando,
Mm.
kind of got bored of that because nothing came of Bob Laycock's Commando units, like Sterling, but a little bit later, wanted to get out and do his own thing. And he knew Sterling, and uh, Sterling asked him to be his 2IC, which he agreed to. And I think George really fell into that role of special forces
Mm.
almost as though he was sort of born to it. I think uh, serving under Sterling, but then more importantly when the SAS was actually sort of restructured after Sterling's capture, and when Sterling was sent off to Colditz, Paddy Mayne took the bulk of forces for the Italian and preparation for the French campaign, so the invasion. And George took D Squadron and some other elements, some of the full boat, special boat section, and formed the SBS Special Boat Squadron for the Aegean
Yeah.
operations. The SBS is such a sort of muddled history because there were, Courtney's SBS in the UK, and then at George's in the Aegean. But essentially, his role was to act as a constant southern threat uh, to Axis forces, to keep them pinned down in the Aegean and Greece. And so he went through this sort of remarkable military career leading up to the Allies getting to Athens as the Germans went out, to make sure that Athens didn't actually fall to LS communist forces. After the war, he tried his stint at diplomacy, and that fell apart because of his affair with another woman. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
that's that. Those were the days.
Mm.
He tried the family business, hated it, didn't fit in. He tried politics, and it was mainly it was in sort of housing and those sort of areas, and then ended up in the early 60s in the Admiralty, and then in opposition went back into business. Didn't particularly like the business he was working in, but then and then had to resign again in the early 70s on the call girl scandal. And I think that was sort of sad that twice in his career, his political career and his diplomatic career, were interrupted by that. But he went on and had an extraordinary sort of philanthropic career, and went back into business, becoming chairman of Tate and Lyle and Davy Corporation. And it was sort of this exceptional man. When he died, my stepmother received 600 letters of condolence, many from people that he just met one time, but
Mm.
he touched their lives in such an extraordinary way. And I felt in the same way, I suppose, with my grandfather, that even though I'd grown up with George, I never really knew the man.
Mm.
And so I wanted to try and, you know, find out about what his war really was. Sadly, a year after I wrote the book, I found all his letters home to his mother from 1939 to 1944, and I couldn't include them in the book. I mean, they added just a nice sort of flavor. But he had the most extraordinary political career, and I think that it's sadly missed now. He was a real crossbencher when he became leader of the House of Lords, and would work with Eddie Shackleton, who was the Labour leader of the House of Lords, so closely that you couldn't actually really discern whose legislation it was. They really worked out the details so that it wasn't an ideological binary a binary ideological question of yes or no, or black or white. It was a compromise that worked for both sides, and that is so missed today. No, I wrote about George, and I wrote about Scapa and
Mm.
the scuttling of the German fleet. I suppose because of the time that I'd spent up in Orkney reading about Scapa, and now I'm actually talking about Things Family. Gone a completely different direction. Well, I wrote a book on the submarine war, and that's going to be published later this year, I think. And that's John Jellicoe's role as first Sea Lord tackling the submarine question. But now as I'm sort of treading water a little bit and thinking about another naval or military book, I'm actually writing a book on my mother
All
and
right.
collecting all her. She was an incredible, a self-taught historian of the first degree. She was born in China and educated in the West, so she always had this sort of east to west point of view and the bridges between civilizations along the Silk Route. And she wrote about things that were as sort of diverse as Islamic architecture in Spain and the Silk Route, and Mughal and Persian gardens and Chinese gardens. And it's fascinating for me to try and read through her stuff and edit it so that it's a little bit more accessible. But it's just a fascinating journey as well. I'm astonished at her erudition, and I find it a shame that somebody's sort of life, unless I take the time to try and bring it together, that somebody's life is sort of just forgotten. It's the sadness of life passing, if you will.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that kind of dive into your family history and your work. And I always personally find it much better to
get to know somebody that I'm talking to, rather than, as I said before, just going, right, Nick, tell us about Jutland. Uh,
Well, from here on out, I may have nothing to say. So,
I'm a wargaming podcast. Are you aware of that as a hobby or as a military tool for?
yeah, absolutely, because there was a lot of wargaming. I've formed a quite close association with sort of U.S. Naval sort of War College or the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And in fact, Jutland was gamed first in Newport, and so they hold it, you know, as being a very important tool in the education of an officer. So I took part. I didn't take part. I observed as they were playing it in Newport, and you realize immediately that one of the things that is so important that comes out of it is actually the ability to take quick decisions based on the information you have, and then to communicate what your objectives and what your desired outcomes are in the most efficient way possible. Apart from thinking about what strategic outcomes may come out of a game. But I remember then they played it in I think it was in at some point in 2017, I think it was, there was a conference at the National Maritime Museum, and the whole Queen's House was made open, and it was gamed on the floors there, the marble floors there.
Mm.
And again, they sort of said, "Would I like to lead the Grand Fleet?" I think Innes actually was there, and Innes took the role. I wouldn't do that. I just didn't want to be in the limelight at all.
Wonderful. Well, you're kind of aware of what we do in our hobbies. So that's wonderful to know. So we'll take a quick break there for our audience, and we'll be back very shortly. And we're going to talk about the background to the battle first.
Do you like The Rest Is History?
Oh yes, I do. I love it. I absolutely love
I
it.
adore it. I adore it. It's such a light-hearted but very, very engaging way of listening to history. I really enjoy those sort of programs.
Yeah, it appeals to my sensibility as well. I enjoy the detail, but I also enjoy that way that they get everything across. And I
Yeah,
listen to whatever it is. It could be 16th century French dressing tables or whatever. I'm listening
yeah,
because I'm
yeah,
interested in it, in the way that they
yeah,
present. So
exactly.
they're very, very good. Not as good as our podcast, obviously. Obviously, Nick. We'll show them. We'll show them. Right, so we'll get back in the
Yeah,
room then.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to part two of the podcast. So, what I want to do in this is this sort of section is look into the background of the battle. You know, the build up to it, and how we got to that part of the sea, um, to the side of Denmark on the 31st of May 1916. So the Royal Navy, Nick, it's had such a long period, hasn't it, of effectively being unchallenged. We've had that, let's call it the glory years of the 18th century and the early 19th century, with the Glorious First, and all those battles with Nelson leading up to Trafalgar. And we're not really challenged, are we, as a nation on the seas? We've stamped our our authority on the world. And what are our kind of policies and priorities as the Royal Navy moves towards World War One?
I think the sort of the expectations uh, for the Royal Navy were utterly unrealistic, and it was sort of, as you say, based on this 100-year plus unbroken record of being unbeaten. But then again, we hadn't really been in battle. In that period, we hadn't been challenged. Other navies were developing, other tactics were being explored and experimented with. The French were, looking very closely at with the Jeune École, the new school of the use of smaller craft, particularly submarines. Their approach appealed to the Germans, but initially more so the Russians. And the Germans initially were building submarines for the Russians'
Right.
use, and then only after the turn of the century started to, after I think about 1906, 1907, started developing their own submarine force. Our the Navy's philosophy was that it was a Mahanian philosophy that the the war at sea would be won by decisive engagements of lines of dreadnought battleships under centralized control, and that these would be, as they say in German, Entscheidungsschlacht, a decisive moment of war. The approach kind of put into the background the importance of protection of trade and really the feeding of the war economy to make battle possible. Yeah. And I think that Britain was particularly vulnerable to a naval interruption of supply, whereas Germany had other land fronts and could get around this isolation, maritime isolation that the British had. But the initial charter, I suppose, objectives for the Navy as the war started out was, really to protect the sea lanes for the delivery of the BEF on the continent, to defend the island against invasion. One sees, 20 years or 25 years later with Sea Lion, just how difficult an undertaking like that might be, or even with June 6, and then the protection of trade. But I think it was really misunderstood what the protection of trade meant, and we thought what we could do is really just protect sea lanes, and fight a battle or fight to protect those sea lanes with a sort of the thinking of the 19th century still in the back of our minds, that we would protect loosely joined convoys of ships and convoy that cross the waters, be able to spot an enemy far off, send off some frigates or some ships to intercept and defeat a threat at distance. And we thought that that would be how we would operate in the First World War. And it was a very rude awakening when the Germans didn't comply with those desires. As Andrew Gordon sort of says, we were sort of stuck in this mentality where we would just steam parallel ships off a chart, shooting at each other, and there was this sort of awful parade ground mentality of how to handle ships at sea.
It seems like we're stuck in that Nelson like thought of lay your ship along the side of the enemy and you can't go wrong. We're still in that mentality, it seems to me.
I think that mentality is still with us
Right,
today.
okay.
And it's why 2016 was, I think, a difficult moment for the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy couldn't quite decide whether Jutland was something they should be celebrating or something that they should be commiserating. And I think the essential truth is, yes, we still live in the lee of Nelson's victory, quote unquote, at Trafalgar. One doesn't sort of stop for a moment to think, actually, the war continued for another 10 years. It wasn't, a defeat at sea didn't translate into an overall defeat of your enemy. But that more importantly, this sort of attempt to try and compare a historically glorified battle, an almost ideal, what's the word? a battle that was sort of almost given
Mm,
mythical
yeah.
proportions, and use that as a way of instruction or as guidelines in spirit for how a battle should be fought in the future was
Mm,
so misleading. And unfortunately, I think David Beatty, as much as I think he had very positive command characteristics elsewhere, was caught up in
mm,
this. He was a absolute Nelson addict, and I think was caught up in the desire to sort of emulate his hero
yeah.
and close with the enemy. As you say, you can do no wrong in closing with your enemy, and yet it gave away all our advantages at the start of the battle.
The Germans, as you alluded to a few moments ago, don't play ball, do they? They start a increase or an arms race effectively. It's Tirpitz, isn't it, who drives that building of a fleet. Whereas Germany, as you say, in the
He,
past, it's been all about, if we go back to Prussia in the Napoleonic Wars, it's all land war. The Franco-Prussian War, it's all land war. We then come to this stage where Germany starts to develop as a naval nation. And how do we as Britain react to that?
I think, I think initially we act with a lot of arrogance, although
Typical.
there are the Jackie Fishers of the world who saw what was going on and understood immediately that this would eventually pose a strategic threat. I mean, I won't say Tirpitz, but certainly the admirals that were initially in command of the Kaiser's newly created baby, had a difficult time of it because, while the Kaiser was building this force, he was certainly at odds with Tirpitz even over how the force was going to be used and what its real primary purpose was. I think Kaiser was very much driven by vanity and what he'd seen at Spithead, at the review of the British ships, and just the massive force that this constituted, and certainly wanted to be part of
Yeah.
that world. And I think he also wanted to show the flag in a very literal sense, in the colonial sense of trying to get a place in the sun. And so, a lot of efforts were made to use
Mm.
naval power to push power, to project power into the Pacific, into Qingdao, into the southern Pacific, Coronel. Certainly at the beginning of the war, that projection of power actually was used to try and draw some British forces off the North
Mm.
Sea, and successfully did so as battle cruisers were sent out to Coronel and other places, the Falklands. But having sort of said that, I think Tirpitz always sort of felt that either he could fight a battle closer to his ports and therefore be able to have a little bit more
Mm.
maneuverability and a safer escape path. He also was looking at the German Navy as being part of his risk theory, that it's maybe fine to defeat one navy, but if you are allied in the right way to another naval power, then you
Mm.
risk that second engagement or the secondary engagement. But there really were, a lot of constraints on the initial admirals, von Pohl, Ingenohl, before Scheer came onto the scene, of how the navy was going to be used. The Kaiser really kept a very tight hand and reorganized the naval high command to split its functioning so that he could do so. Whereas the army, as you say, being the sort of traditional, land power that Germany was, the army had a very centralized and very strong command structure.
You mentioned Jackie Fisher there, and obviously he has a tremendous influence on the development of weaponry. And Dreadnought, of course, is one of those moments in history where everything suddenly changes. We've gone from the typical design, just for listeners, is two main turrets with a large caliber gun, two large caliber guns in both ends, and then a row of secondary armament down the side in casemates, which is usually smaller, lower caliber, and there's less fire control between the two types of armament. Whereas Dreadnought comes along, bang, one large caliber, easier supply, easier fire, easier ranging. It's kind of an overnight
Mm.
revolution, isn't it? That one ship.
It's an overnight revolution, but I mean, Fisher has been criticized for the way the introduction was handled, in the sense that until that point, even if one can say that there were some dreadnought developments going on
Yeah.
elsewhere, up to that point, we could rely and fall back on superiority of numbers of roughly equal quality of ships. The dreadnought revolution was one that leveled the playing field, and at that point it became who could produce ships of that new design in the fastest way. The British, after the sort of initial success of initial sort of acknowledgement of the quality and superiority of dreadnought, were almost immediately facing severe parliamentary kickback in the 1909 naval budgets, which put Jackie Fisher and my father, and my grandfather, I should say, in direct conflict with David Lloyd George, and at that point, Churchill. Eventually, they won that, but it left a very bad taste that came back to bite later on in 1917. I think the German production, though, was very, very well organized by Tirpitz. And so there was a real fear by John Jellicoe, for example, that we could actually lose this naval arms race, even if in 1909, they got 8 or whatever it was, 6 or 8 dreadnoughts. But the German production lines were being very, very well organized by Tirpitz, very competitive, great concentration into new yards, going from sort of Blohm Voss and Kiel, Hamburg to Schichau and the eastern Baltic. Very, very efficient at the start of the war, and I think Tirpitz was quite canny politically in the way that he put the budgets and the approvals through, in the sense that once you were in, it was almost impossible to get out. And so, the German legislature, the Reichstag, passed these naval laws, not quite realizing that they'd actually now kind of couldn't back away from it. And Tirpitz just laid it on year after year. The novella, I think they called them. So, for me, Dreadnought is a tiny bit of a sort of misnomer. I mean, it immediately introduced the idea of a sort of 2-ship quality navy. And that did come back to roost at Jutland. Both sides had the so-called, the British had these sort of armored cruisers, and the Germans had what they called the 5-Minuten-Schiffe,
5-minute fleet.
old pre-dreadnoughts
Yeah.
that weren't going to last. And all it did was actually just make the question of command that much more difficult, because you had ships of different caliber, different quality, different performance, different speeds, making up the battle lines.
I suppose once you've got that, in inverted commas, inferior ship within your battle line, it doesn't matter if you can do 28 knots if your slowest ship can only do 17.
Well, and then we had the sort of disasters of HMS Defence and Warrior being caught out right at the beginning of the main battle actions, and
It's not a good place to be. Not a good place to be. And we also see the development of torpedoes as a new weapon and a new fleet weapon. They've been around, I think, in the American Civil War, but as a fleet weapon, that starts to develop in the start of the war, and of course they've never been used in action, so nobody really knows, do they, how effective they are going to be, what the best tactic to use them and to defend against them.
I think what it did was, as you say, the development was
Mm.
incredibly fast in terms of the range, programmability, and reliability. British torpedoes actually were pretty unreliable. I think one can probably conclude. Britain gave away, as you know, much of its technology by not supporting torpedo development and allowing it to be taken by
Mm.
Whitehead to Trieste, which became then the powerhouse of torpedo development for the German and Austro-Hungarian navies. Getting back to this, though, I think when one sees the range of the launch range sort of going up to sort of 14,000, 15,000 yards, if I'm remembering correctly. Um, I may be wildly wrong on this because my memory does fade sometimes. But then it sort of changes the nature of the engagement right away, and the objective of of the main gunnery engagement is to keep an opponent's battle line beyond
Mm.
torpedo launch range, because the torpedo launch then is is an unseen enemy, and as Bacon was writing at the time, that it became sort of almost statistically a foregone conclusion that if you launched a wide enough spread of torpedoes with
Something's going to hit
against the
something, isn't
battle line,
it?
statistically you would have a hit, and that was always kind of sitting in the back of JRJ's mind, and indeed it became one of the points on which he was probably most
Yeah.
criticized.
We've had a nice build up there of the technology involved. So let's move on to the people. So let's concentrate on John Jellicoe first. He's obviously at this point he's at the top of the naval rankings, if you like. So just briefly then, did he come from a naval family? How did his career development to the point we are now, where he's the top guy?
His father, John Henry, in fact, worked for the Southampton Mail
Mm.
Company, and rose, I think he was commanding his own ship by age 20, he'd gone to sea at 12, was commanding his own ship at 20. And so he certainly had
Yeah.
that maritime background there. Through John Henry's wife, actually the line goes back
Mm.
to Trafalgar and to some of the third Admiralty. And so, yes, JRJ grew up in a very, very strong tradition
Mm.
of the sea. He excelled academically, but they weren't particularly rich, and I think that there was a certain question of whether he could actually stay in school at a certain point. They found the money, they kept him in school, and he eventually, because of a connection, was able to get in to the Naval College right from the start. Had a fairly brilliant career. He was very, very good in maths and sciences and engineering. And the maths and sciences, I think, really stood him in good stead when he took on his specialization, which was
Mm.
gunnery. He'd been noticed by Jackie Fisher, who took him on board one of the Navy's early leading gunnery ships. And the two of them worked very, very closely right from the start on that. JJ then following in Jackie Fisher's, I won't say in footsteps, but
Yeah.
following on his coattails, became his assistant at as assistant director of naval ordnance, worked on shell development, worked on sort of quick firing, small caliber guns. I think at that point sort of was starting to think more and more about the casemate guns being used to sort of as close anti-torpedo defense, if you will, and to also disturb sighting
Mm.
the splash. Um, but then, curiously enough, like Beatty, the only real naval experience that they have as officers is on land. Both of them were in China. John Jellicoe had wanted actually to be in the Sudan, which is really where Beatty made his name, but was not allowed. His commanding officer wouldn't let him take that position. But it is sort of strange that these officers who worked to command uh, you know pretty sizable collections of ships had never really actually taken part in a sea action before.
Yeah.
So he gets his, I suppose, his first sort of really major sort of command of fleet command, though, is really when he becomes he becomes CNC of the Atlantic Fleet, and I think that's around sort of 1910, and that gives him some of the experience that he really needs leading up to Jutland, because he was very clearly Fisher's choice as a commander, and I think you know Fisher was also disappointed in the outcome, and probably he criticized his own choice.
I think certainly reading through your book about those early years, John certainly seemed to excel and was always in the top sort of 5% of his class.
Yeah.
And that seems to have pushed him on with this. I think at that time, similar to day to day, really, there's an element of how good you are and an element of who your mates are. And
Oh,
he's
who your
got,
mates are is
yeah,
incredibly important. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of those friendships that were made at the sort of early days of Greenwich, like with Hugh Evan Thomas, came back, and it was probably too much. So who your mates were was kind of like the officer selection pool. That was a very bad thing, frankly.
yeah.
Even though before Jutland, JRJ had actually wanted to remove some officers, one of them, I think, being Arbuthnot, and because of the social connections, wasn't allowed to take him out of the line of battle. And the reason was not wanting to have slower ships in the line, but admiralty connections and all the rest of it made that impossible.
Because if you go back to Nelson's time, you have those red, blue, white, yellow squadrons, and seniority is important. And if you want to get promoted, then it's got to be the next in seniority. And if that isn't quite right, they shove them into the yellow squadron, and then people overtake them.
Yeah,
And it's all nepotism, I
I
think, is the way.
I think that is absolutely central to the
Yeah,
ossification of the Royal Navy.
yeah,
It's and Fisher did all he could to fight that and to introduce more meritocracy, and to sort of say, this is ridiculous. The pool from which we are pulling key decision makers is far too small. So he did a lot in terms of educational help for new blood to come into the
mm.
officer ranks.
So if we think about then the other main character, let's say, for the British in Beatty, we've talked a little bit about him as we've gone on. He has that leg up through Churchill, doesn't he? That's where his
Yeah.
support comes from, and he rises through the ranks. And I think he's younger, isn't he, than John Jellicoe by quite a bit?
Oh, yes, far younger.
Yeah.
Far younger. He's about, I think, David Beatty died in 1936, in the beginning of 36. John Jellicoe died in, I think it was November. Yes, it was just after Armistice
Mm,
in 1935. David Beatty was 10 years younger,
mm,
but I think after the experience both of them had utterly exhausted by
mm.
both his war duty and then his continued position as First Lord. Beatty was young. He was far more connected socially than John Jellicoe was. Was good friends with, I think, had a close friendship with the king. Like John Jellicoe, married into money.
Mm.
John Jellicoe married into the Kaiser shipping money. Beatty married into the Marshall Fields department store wealth. I think both admirals respected each other. They didn't have much time to actually work together with each other because one was based up in Scapa, the other was in Rosyth. The wives were very, very different. I think Gwendolyn Jellicoe was much more a traditional naval wife and understood her role more than Ethel did, who was very outspoken and quite political and
Yeah.
quite I think quite damaging actually at times
Mm.
to David Beatty's career. But I think that they both had, David Beatty was very charismatic, clearly liked to see a bigger picture and leave the detail to others. John Jellicoe was meticulous, very, very intellectually astute, but would hamper himself by getting far too involved in too much detail and really didn't understand the need for more delegation. Not to say that, when the battle was finally joined, that there was over command, because I don't think that was necessarily the case. I think that would have been catastrophic actually had he loosened the reins too much in the on the afternoon of 31st of May, because the conditions were so abominable,
Mm.
and I think there would have been an ensuing chaos in the battle lines. But I think Beatty is he actually came to the rescue of my grandfather when my grandfather was shot in the lung in China, and wrote his will on the battlefield because he didn't think he was going to make it. And Christopher Craddock and David Beatty actually escorted uh, John Jellicoe back on a stretcher to recuperate. Beatty was also wounded, and both of them had problems with their wounds right through their lives.
So what year was that, Nick?
That would have been 1900, because they were John Jellicoe was out in China as Seymour's chief of staff on, I think, the first relief expedition to Peking, during the
Mm.
so-called 55 days at Peking. It never got through. They got blocked on the rail lines and very fiercely attacked. And John Jellicoe was shot and handed over command to one of the Germans, Guido von Ustorm, who was later in charge of the imperial docks
Oh,
and yards.
yeah.
So there was a connection. And funnily enough, just in the last sort of 6 months, I made contact with Guido von Ustorm's grandson.
Oh,
Scheer's adopted great grandson is a
mm,
great friend of mine, and he and I have
fantastic.
worked closely to Max Schultz. I met his grandson. Max Schultz was the guy who led the torpedo attack before the turnaway. I met his grandson. Funny enough, it was in Wilhelmshaven during one of the German commemoration ceremonies. This is a total tangent, but
Mm.
it's
That's what the show's all about.
it's a nice moment. I was with my cousin, and we were deciding where to lay our wreath, and I wanted to lay them on one of the German, because it's German, it was a German
Mm.
cemetery. I wanted to lay it on one of the German graves, and I thought rather than just laying it on anyone, I saw Max Schultz's gravestone, so we went and laid it on Max Schultz's gravestone, and his grandson saw us from about 100 yards or so away and came and introduced himself. And that was
Oh, lovely.
you can
Yeah,
imagine, that was a wonderful, wonderful meeting.
fantastic. Yeah.
So all those things, as a complete aside, all those sort of meetings of the descendants and the grandchildren has been, you know, really a kind of blessing for me. Another one is Nat Sims, who was William Sowden Sims's grandson. William Sowden Sims commanded the U.S. forces in 1917 when war was declared. Total tangent.
Amazing. Yeah,
My
yeah.
apologies.
No, that is absolutely fine. That's what this podcast is all around. We've not started on fish and chips yet, so we've not gone off
We'll get
as we'll get there eventually.
there.
So I suppose one of the long-lasting things with Jutland is this character clash, for want of a better
Yeah,
word, between Jellicoe and Beatty,
yeah.
and I think sometimes historians obviously like to sell books, so they like to emphasize certain parts of characters.
Are you
Um,
thinking of Eric Grove here as you say this? In his memory. In his
yeah, I
memory.
couldn't possibly comment. Um, but you kind of, from me, from an outside perspective, I kind of get the picture of Jellicoe kind of sat in an armchair and pointing his pipe gently in the direction that he wants his ships to move, and everything works magically. And then with Beatty, I don't know if you're familiar with the film Doctor Strangelove,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
but there's a bit where the guy's riding the missile.
Pickens.
Yeah,
Sam Pickens.
yeah, yeah. I,
Yes.
and that's how Beatty can come across in some historical references.
Well, I think, for both of them, I mean, one doesn't question their courage for
Mm,
a second. I mean, Beatty was
yeah,
on on Lyon's bridge. Lyon took something like 9 hits during, the combined run to the south and run to the north, and the famous hit on what was it? Was it the center turret? It's Q turret or whatever.
where
Um,
the roof comes off and
yeah,
stops the ship
and
exploding. Yeah.
the battle was so fierce that none of them kind of realized what had happened. Admirals, unlike generals, have to command either from the vanguard, but at least they have to command from their ships. And
Mm,
their thinking was that it would be best that JRJ would be center of the battle line so that flag signals could go up and down the line as fast as possible on either side. But I think it's wrong to think of him as sort of very sedentary and whatever. In
mm.
fact, he was sort of noted for, you know, people would kind of comment that they would hear this sort of fast metallic click, and they knew that was JRJ kind of approaching. Those were his metal studs on his shoes,
Yeah.
clicking on the deck. And he would come and he would be quiet and just observe something, and then he would sort of make his announcement. The famous equal speed. What is it? What is it?
Mm,
Equal speed, Charlie London. Uh,
mm,
the famous signal, which was
mm.
slightly corrected by his signals officer to make sure there was no ambiguity on it. But that was done after sort of 20 or 30 seconds of quiet reflection, and then the announcement was made, and it was made from a very difficult position where he didn't have a firm understanding exactly where the German fleet was going to appear on his starboard beam,
Mm.
or what would be his starboard beam. And so it was a highly, highly tense moment. And I think that's where John Jellicoe actually excelled. I think he was able to take very deliberate, very decisive, carefully thought out decisions in the heat of the battle without getting rattled. Whereas I think, and I always hesitate to sort of criticize because I don't particularly like this battle between the characters, but I think that that's where actually David Beatty was not so good, because I think, he would get the bit in between his teeth. As JRJ said to him one time, I know you're a fox hunting man, you like to just go for the
Yeah.
chase. But he
Yeah.
would get the bit in his mouth and he would kind of be relentless. It's admirable in one sense, but it put his ships and his crews and his men in danger
Mm.
needlessly, when he could have actually used not necessarily superior speed, because it turned out the German battle cruisers were just as fast, but certainly they had some range advantages and they had some broadside weight advantages that they could have used, and they didn't use that. It was Hipper that actually opened fire probably first,
Mm.
and the British that joined in 30 seconds after. So I think David Beatty has a sort of, you know, he is a charismatic character. When he took over the Grand Fleet after JRJ, it was a very difficult move for him because JRJ was loved, and a lot of people didn't like him, didn't like his background, didn't like his battle cruiser connections. But he won it through, even though he moved his flag to Queen Elizabeth. I think both admirals really did not like how their roles were politicized and how their roles were driven apart by supporters on either side, whether it was, you know, Harper or Bacon supporting Jellicoe, or whoever supporting Beatty, but it did nobody any good. I think Jellicoe probably was slower to react, but he nevertheless reacted in the same way, and sometimes kind of like, it got his goat up as well, and he would come back and demand corrections on what eventually would become the Harper report and whatever.
I think it's fair. I think it's it's something that we've seen throughout history with commanders. Obviously, there are different types of commanders, and I think you go into it in some detail in your book about how there are times when you need that careful, considered commander who will weigh up all his options and make a rational decision based on the information at hand. Wellington is another one who I would sort of kind of put in that category as a thinker rather than a bit of flash.
Yeah,
And then we look at other parts of history, and we have the Prince Rupert of the Rhine and his charging cavalry, Marshal
yeah,
Ney, Marshal
yeah,
Murat.
yeah,
These
yeah.
people who lead in a different way. They lead from the front. How they don't get killed, I've got no idea. One of the big things that I've been reading about recently is Garibaldi, Giuseppe
Oh
Garibaldi.
yes,
And,
Giuseppe.
and if you read his history, it's like,
I know.
how are you not dead? A
Yeah,
thousand
yeah,
times before we get to
yeah, yeah.
the Risorgimento. So I think quite rightly, there's different commanders for different times and different roles within a battle. And I think Jellicoe sees that, doesn't he, with Beatty? He puts him in a position where, maybe with the battle cruisers a little bit, I mean, maybe he went too far, maybe we'll come to that in a minute, but that thrust is what is required in that initial phase.
Yeah, I think though that Jellicoe is guilty of not really. I mean, he knew it was going to be difficult to control David Beatty. That's for sure. He resisted the idea of the battle cruiser fleet as opposed to the battle cruiser force.
He was worried about Beatty, yeah.
He was very worried about him because he sort of said, "Listen, you have admirable characteristics,
Mm.
but don't get fooled by the Germans and pulled into a trap because they know you for the character that you are." And I think that where one sees the sort of difference between sort of Hipper and Scheer, who actually didn't particularly like each other. I think they quite disliked each other, and Scheer, I think, was having sort of second thoughts about Hipper and wanted to move him out of that position. But the Aufklärungsgruppe, the reconnaissance group, did its job as a reconnaissance group,
Mm.
whereas the battle cruiser fleet was used more as an independent fleet, as an adjunct as an independent fleet on the sea, on the battlefield that day, rather than as an integral part of the Grand Fleet. So I think that maybe this was because JRJ was not particularly clear about what he regarded as Beatty's role. I certainly think there's some of that. I
Yeah.
think some of it is understandable because physically they were, as I said, one up in Scapa and one in Rosyth. And you look at the letters that go between them, there's nothing better than a one-to-one contact.
Yes, definitely.
Even if they'd had video, it would have been
Yeah.
better. But these sort of letters discussing rate of fire, it almost becomes sort of academic.
Yeah.
And, Beattie just doesn't get the point that John Jellicoe is making, which is rate of fire is great once you have established the target and are tracking the target really closely and competently. But to initiate action with high speed, high rate of fire is very dangerous because you can't rigorously follow the splash
Yeah.
and see what is actually happening. And so I think that my feeling is that the Germans, the integrity of their fleet structure was far better on the day than the Royal Navy's was. During that 70 minutes or so of the run to the south, there was not one single piece of reliable reconnaissance information going back to John Jellicoe steaming south on Iron Duke in the 6-column formation. He had no idea exactly what was happening. And indeed, I think that Scheer probably knew about the fate of Indefatigable and Queen Mary before John Jellicoe did,
Right.
because
Wow.
Beattie just didn't want to sort of tell him, I'm sorry, my forces has been depleted rather seriously. But Queen Mary was considered she was one of the most modern battle cruisers. She was also considered a sort of exemplary gunnery ship,
Yeah, she was a gunnery
and yet
champion, wasn't she? Yeah.
and yet, 20 or so minutes, 25 minutes after Indefatigable goes, she goes as well.
Mm. So just before we finish off this section and move on to the battle itself, um, I think we just need to very briefly talk about the other characters on the other side, if you like, Shear and
Mm.
Hipper, who are effectively the counterparts to Jellicoe and Beattie, um, and quite often. I don't know whether you kind of agree with this, but quite often in British histories, these two characters are not really commentated on, and a lot of the criticism that comes towards Jellicoe is based around thinking that these two guys are just robots and they're not thinking
Yeah,
commanders themselves who
yeah, yeah,
are actually quite good at their job. So,
yeah.
you know, so
I think Hipper was probably the best admiral on the seas that day.
yeah,
In fact, he had a sort of a very instinctive style of command. And initially he went into battle outnumbered, and then came out and had reversed the superiority. And he did what he was supposed to do. He acted as reconnaissance, and then he acted also as bait,
mm,
and did so, very, very effectively. Sheer is more difficult to kind of really grasp. And I've actually
yeah,
been trying to prod Reinhardt, his great grandson, to see if I could
yes,
get some more info, but I haven't managed to.
yeah,
But Scheer is more difficult, I think, to conclude on, because his handling of the main battle fleet is in many ways sort of strategically incredibly sound, but then
mm,
tactically goes wrong. It goes wrong right at the beginning because they get caught in this terrible uh, almost crossfire of the two T's. But his intentions are quite interesting. On the second time he went back into attack the battle line, he thought he could probably get through just behind, but he miscalculated where the squadrons were because the visibility was so bad. But then his calculations at night were very, very sensible indeed. Again,
mm,
he surmised pretty well where the British destroyers were, and that it was a covering, the 58 British destroyers that were covering the sort of the stern of the Grand Fleet as they steamed south. And he made it an absolute determined effort to break through, and did that. So I think Scheer is incredibly persistent, but also has this
mm.
sort of let's see. I really am trying to find the right word here because it's quite important. He is quite prepared to sacrifice what is needed at any moment. JRJ would never have made the sacrifices that Scheer was consciously doing, sending his battle cruisers
Yes.
in and sending the torpedo boats in as almost on a death run. And the determination to break through at night is durchhalten, just keep on going no matter what.
Mm.
I don't think John Jellicoe would have made that, and I think that it's interesting now. One of the things that I always feel very uncomfortable with sort of, you know, if sort of say somebody like Andrew Gordon says, well, you know, he should have turned towards torpedoes, he would have lost maybe a dreadnought or two. Well, it's not just a
Yeah.
question of losing a dreadnought or two, because that certainly would have actually tipped the strategic balance numerically between the
Mm.
fleets, and that was something that was quite of very high concern to JRJ. But also the fact that, you know, that's probably 2,400, 2,500 men,
Yes.
and you don't take those decisions lightly. Whereas I think Scheer was more ruthless,
Mm.
and certainly his sort of political leanings after the war kind of underline that. Whereas Hipper fades away, and sadly, there is no Hipper family left. So you can't
Right.
talk to anybody to get a different point of view. But I've always admired Hipper, I think, as a commander more than
Yeah.
anybody else.
Well, thank you very much for the detailed look at the characters involved. And we'll take a short break again for the audience, and we'll be back in a second. And we're going to talk about the battle itself.
Well, for the reasons explained at the start of the episode, it's not going to be a short break between the part we just completed and the actual discussion of the battle itself. It's going to be a couple of weeks, but let's hope that anticipation builds during that time. So nothing much for me to say today, because you know who the next episode's going to be in 2 weeks' time. And I hope you enjoyed that first part of the episode, and you'll tune in next time. So until then, see thee.